My name's Mark Chidley. I am the SME customer representative on the Open Banking Implementation Entity Steering Group. And in that role, I've had the privilege of chairing a series of SME forums leading up to this one. They started relatively normally and of course became more or less abnormal following events that sort of hit the world earlier this year. And what we're trying to focus on in this session is effectively how open banking products and services can help small businesses not just survive the COVID crisis, but critically recover. Surviving businesses will be of no use to the UK's economy if they don't then recover and get back to some kind of normality. I just want to point out that the invitation set out a sort of session structure, which we have developed, I think it's fair to say, since then. And we will be approaching things in a slightly different way based on the learning we've had from similar events that open banking has been holding, with a view just to trying to keep things a little bit more dynamic and to make sure that everybody gets full value from the session. So we will be, broadly speaking, having the following sections. We're going to talk about the changes that COVID is making for small businesses. We're going to then talk about the use of credit, because that's become a very critical component of government schemes, for example, to keep the show on the road for small businesses. We're then going to look at possible roles for open banking. I'm then going to ask each of our participants to identify a single item that they think could make the single biggest difference, and then we'll open up to questions. That said, if you've got something you want to say, do please use the chat and other mechanisms as Connie has described already, and we will pick those up and come back to them and catch them before we close. So, coming back to our main theme of recovery for small businesses from the crisis, first of all, I'm going to look at the question of the changes that COVID is making for small businesses as they seek to survive and recover. There's a lot of changes to the landscape. Some businesses inevitably won't survive. For those that do, things will be different. And I'm going to ask each of our specialists to make a contribution now, and before they do so, if they can briefly introduce themselves and then go on to talk about how they see small businesses being changed by the COVID experience. So Philip, if I could turn first to you.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon to everybody on this call. My name's Philip King. I'm the current interim Small Business Commissioner and have been in post since the end of January this year. Prior to that, I'd spent 41 years working in credit management for a variety of organisations, and for the last 14 years running a professional body for people working in credit management. So cash flow and payment of invoices to suppliers and collecting payment from customers has been my passion for a long time, and I'm fortunate that I continue to live that passion in my current role. To answer your question, Mark, the impact of COVID on small businesses has been interesting over recent times. We've seen various statistics that 1 in 5 businesses won't survive, that 1 in 3 of those businesses that closed won't reopen, that information from the ONS fairly recently that 58% of closed businesses wouldn't reopen, and that 42% of businesses had less than 6 months cash. And last week we heard that the economy was down 20.4%. So the impact on the economy and on businesses has been seismic, and we cannot underestimate that. One of the things that's important to me in my role, and that I see all too often, is that we get fixated on the transactional nature of late payment of invoices and overlook the emotional impact on small business owners when they aren't paid. And I've talked to numerous small businesses over the last few months who've talked to me about sleep deprivation, mood swings, relationship breakdowns, impact on their well-being and mental health, all as a result of laying in bed at night awake, worrying about whether or not payment is going to arrive from a key customer or not. And last week, my team successfully collected some money for a business of less than £1,000, which in itself sounds pretty insignificant. But for that business, I can tell you, was absolutely major and a huge input to their bank account and made a real difference to their life, their family, and their well-being last week. So I think the impacts are really important. And one of the key changes that I think we've seen is the increase in level of communication between buyers and suppliers. I've talked to countless businesses, and I'll come back to this a bit later on, I suspect, in this conversation. But I've talked to countless small businesses that have talked to their large suppliers and found them supportive, and have been willing to open up and be honest about how vulnerable they are and how much risk they're currently facing. And similarly, large businesses that are facing real cash flow issues are having conversations in their supply chain. And that level of communication is both encouraging and really important. I think it's worth just saying that the Small Business Commissioner's Office was set up in 2017 under the Enterprise Act. We exist to help businesses, large and small, resolve differences. We exist to offer help, advice and support to small businesses. And we do all of that free, so there's no charge for our services. I have a team of caseworkers who provide support and advice and signpost to other services that are available. But in the recent crisis, we've so far collected over £500,000 for small businesses, where my team have directly picked up the phone, talked to a large business and got them to make payment of something that hasn't been paid. And that's simply because we have a little bit more clout when we ring up as a Small Business Commissioner's Office than an individual micro business might do when they ring up on their own account. I think that's enough from me for Mark now, so I'll hand back.
Thank you, Philip, for that. If I could turn now to Andrea, if you could perhaps introduce yourself and provide us with some observations from your point of view on the changes that you're seeing from COVID.
Yes, thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrea Reynolds, and I'm CEO and founder of swoopfunding.com. In terms of Swoop itself, we launched in May 2018 to leverage open banking and other APIs to essentially deliver a one-stop shop for businesses looking to raise and save money. So businesses can come on, integrate all their different data sources, cloud accounting, company's house, credit scoring, and of course open banking, and then we match them to what they are eligible for across loans, grants, investment, and successfully get the funding for them. In addition to that, we have a spend analyzer tool, which through open banking, we're able to analyze key areas of spending for businesses where we can not just identify the savings for them, but actually help them achieve that. So that's across banking, FX, utilities, broadband, etc. We launched in May 2018, and of course, pre-COVID, the mainstay of our customers, of which we have over 40,000, have been businesses that are sort of 5 years, 6 years and younger. So early adopters of technology, and so going to an online platform is an obvious behavior for them. Where we've seen the lag, particularly in open banking, has been the more mature businesses. All of that has completely changed since COVID-19. So what we've seen is not just, we've seen 1,000% increase in customer demand coming onto our platform, but the more interesting stat is in relation to the profile of those businesses. Much older businesses now turning to digital solutions where they would have traditionally gone to a bank manager or somebody where they may have gone into a branch. So that's one of the key trends. In terms of bank integrations, we've seen a 700% increase. So that's people utilizing open banking truly, I don't think businesses are particularly aware of the name open banking, but what they're seeing is if I integrate here, you're going to give me a solution faster than I've been getting. We built a COVID-19 triage platform for businesses, and really where we feel we're playing a role within COVID-19 is in relation to, you've got banks and the accredited lenders who are desperately trying to deal with the overwhelming demand. You've got multiple announcements being made, new accredited lenders coming on board every single week. You've got changes in lending criteria and risk appetite, so it's a constantly evolving situation. So what Swoop does is it keeps all of that up to date, and it gets the businesses money ready. And what I mean by that is there's work that businesses need to do to make sure they're eligible and viable. And rather than going down the wasted route of applying and then being rejected, what we're doing is ensuring they are eligible, viable, and have their documentation ready. And where they are getting rejected by banks because lenders have different appetites, different models, we're then able to triage that to alternative lenders. So I think in terms of trends, we're seeing mass acceleration of digital adoption, including the older, more mature businesses. We're seeing, of course, where pre-COVID-19 we had the majority of UK SMEs are permanent non-borrowers. That is the term given to them. They would never seek external finance, and in particular credit. That's completely changed. We have over 610,000 who are now have for the first time a loan on their balance sheet. So where we now need to be thinking about is not just about COVID-19, it's about the recovery. And I think we're going to discuss a little bit about that further on in this session, but that's just some immediate insights for you in terms of what we're seeing in the market right now.
Andrea, thank you very much. And you've highlighted the sort of speed with which things are happening. And perhaps on the opposite side of your digital adoption coin is the move away from the use of cash. And Natalie Seeney, who chaired a committee and produced a report on access to cash a year or so ago, it's been very interesting because in the early stages of the crisis, she was saying that things that she had anticipated and her committee had anticipated might take years appeared now to be happening in months. And only yesterday, she produced an article in the Times in response to calls for the abolition of cash. So I think that's an example of how the pace of change is quite extraordinary. And I would recommend that people look at Natalie's article, particularly if they are seduced by the thought of the abolition of cash, for which one can see some good arguments, but until there are digital alternatives reliably available to everybody, I think that's a step too far. Anyway, if I could now introduce Wendy, and if you can introduce yourself and identify the trends that you're seeing for our audience, that would be terrific.
Of course. Hello, everyone. I am Wendy Tapia. I am responsible for global banking services at Sage. For those who may not be very familiar with the organization, we specialize on accounting software. And in my banking services, we spend a lot of time in trying to understand how to make easier for businesses to keep an eye on their cash flow. That is obviously critical to any business health. But personally, you know, from kind of the mission point of view, I've made it my mission for a number of years now to make sure that I help businesses reimagine the future. How can they leverage automation and innovation to bring forward their business? How can they save time in certain aspects that have been overlooked or a little bit too passively embraced for too long? And, you know, I'm really excited to be here. I find a couple of the points that you've already made, guys, really, really interesting. I think Andrea was pointing out something that is a perfect match with the trends that we are seeing at the moment. This continuous flow of information, right? It's not only media outlets and everything that we hear from the news. It's also about the funding that is available to businesses, and how can businesses navigate this constant flow of information. I think there are a lot of pain points that have existed in there for a while. And the trend we're seeing really is that those pain points are just getting more acute. The needs of the businesses haven't changed, just the pandemic is driving them with a much higher urgency, an urgency we've never seen before. And for example, at Sage, what we did, right, when we perceived this huge amount of information was, well, the first thing that businesses will be looking for is a reliable and trusting source of information. So we put together our tools, we raised our teams to build a coronavirus assessment tool that serves the purpose for businesses to come online and do a quick assessment of what are the likely funds that they could have access to. So keeping these parties and everyone involved in businesses, it is critical in these times, right? And I also wanted to make a comment, Phil, because you actually mentioned something really important that I think is often overlooked in this kind of conversation. We perceive business as all about the money. It's this cold operation that is all about the money. And it actually is the contrary. It's about humans, humans who are stressed, humans who may not be 100% healthy. So it is this time in which we want to make sure that technology and innovation helps businesses get off a little bit the burden that they are seeing, right? It's just like, at least you don't have to worry about trivial things like reconciliation. You can focus on something more important in your business.
Wendy, thank you. And what I want to do now is to move on. We've identified a number of trends, and we've also, I think, identified that credit has been an important component, both in helping businesses, but also having these other impacts, particularly for people who haven't been used to managing a credit line in the past. So if we can focus now a bit more on borrowing and the impacts that that either increased or new borrowing is having on small businesses, and coming to you, Andrea, first, and looking at your thoughts about that and the role that open banking might begin to play.
Yes, so as I mentioned, we now have the majority of businesses who previously would never have considered credit now have credit. And you see the concerns being aired every day in the media, where banks are now saying they fear that, you know, over half of those took out a bounce back will default, that at least a quarter of the loans that they gave out and distributed, they wouldn't have under normal lending conditions. So we've got a bit of a perfect storm that's about to come down the track, and we need to get businesses ready for it so that they can survive and recover from it. So what I mean by that is we have a bounce back that, or maybe a CBIL or whatever, which is probably putting out the fires right now and will enable businesses to survive the lockdown. We then need to start shifting our attention now very quickly to recovery. How are we going to finance those businesses for their recovery plans? And that also takes into account when the repayments start to kick in for their bounce back or their CBILs or whatever other credit line that they got right now. So, you know, there's a big part to play for open banking, and some of the use cases that we are developing already with the alternative lenders is we're going to get to a place where banks will be overwhelmed in terms of managing their portfolio and doing credit analysis. You're going to have businesses, let's just take, for example, somebody who, or maybe they're in retail and they've got a term loan under one of those schemes. It's probably going to be a better fit for them in terms of recovery that their repayments are based on revenue, a percentage of their revenue, rather than a fixed amount coming out of their account every single month. Now, a bank would traditionally say, you know, this business doesn't have the payments coming through consistently. And so then they're looking at, is this business solvent? Well, it might be that the business isn't liquid enough to take on board that additional fixed term payment in addition to all the other costs that they have for recovery. So we might need to start looking at whether we refinance those loans, whether we give them the better tools. So we're developing tools where businesses can see much further earlier on in the track as to where they're going to have issues in terms of repayments. So predicting for them where they're going to perhaps meet obstacles, and then matching them to a better source of finance where they're not defaulting. The key point here is not to get these businesses into such a state of distress that they default and perhaps need to wind up the business. So you mentioned, you know, emotion, etc. The biggest emotion we're getting from our customers is making them feel empowered, that they know that they're making good financial decisions. For, you know, for most of them, they don't know, is this the amount I should be taking? Is this right for my age and my sector, what I'm doing? And so when you can support them with financial decisions and actually empower them to make switches or get better lending results, I think that's the power of open banking. And the second point about open banking is, in terms of where we're going with the big credit bubble we will now have, is a lot of the lenders have now moved from physical documentation, so bank statements, PDF statements, to now preferring open banking data. And so we've got 10 alternative lenders now who are actually using our open banking data as the information, the transactional history they need to make auto decisions. So we're speeding up lending decisions. We're reducing the threat of fraud because they can't manipulate documents that comes direct from source. And it's helping those lenders further on post distribution, that they're able to manage those businesses. So I think open banking is really going to come into its own in the recovery phase, both obviously now, but particularly in the recovery phase. So I'm quite optimistic about the future of open banking.
Andrea, thank you. And we'll come on and explore the role of open banking in our next session. Philip, perhaps I can turn to you now for your observations on the use of credit by small businesses.
Yes, Mark. I think that if we think the last 3 months have been tough, then we haven't seen anything yet. And I think the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months are going to be incredibly tough. And Andrea's touched on some really interesting points. I think people's business models will have changed. I think if cash flow is always deemed to be king, for the next 18 months, it's going to be king, emperor, president, and whatever other label you want to give it. I think we're going to see cash flow management being so important, and Andrea touched on that, and the importance of knowing where the business are and when the needs are going to arise. I think we're going to see a change in risk perspectives because people's balance sheets will have changed. Businesses prior to COVID that had no borrowing will now have borrowing. They've delayed filing accounts because they've been allowed to. So businesses lending and providing credit to businesses are going to be looking at a very different picture from what the paper might suggest. And so they're going to have to take a very different view. And I think we're going to see some restrictions in credit available to small businesses. If I was a plumber looking to get supplies from one of the big, trade suppliers, builders merchants, I might find that they're being a bit more choosy about how much credit they give me, on what terms, and so on, because they're going to be managing their own risk portfolio. So we're going to see a very different element to business. And I think what we've seen, and we will see, I think, a temptation on the part of bigger business to delay, extend, suspend payments to their small supply chains. That's something I think we've got to resist very firmly. But not all big business is bad. We're seeing some really good examples of what businesses are doing, and that's really important. And I think finally on this segment, I would say that one of the things that always strikes me talking to small businesses, and I think Andrea alluded to this, is that they tend not to see beyond the overdraft as the route to solve their problems. So they ask for an overdraft. If they can't get it, they turn to a credit card or friends and family or some other means. And the banks traditionally haven't been very good at looking at a business and working out what their holistic needs are and coming up with a package of finance that works for them. And small businesses have generally, in my view, been frightened of solutions they're not familiar with, and they see some of the fintech providers and solutions as being a dark art they ought to try and avoid, when actually the converse is absolutely the truth. And Andrea made a really interesting point to me about open banking. And I'm not an open banking expert by any stretch, but for me, open banking is a means to better outcomes, not an end in itself. And I think if we can get small businesses to be more aware of the options available to them and manage their businesses better, then the chances are that a year or two from now, we'll see more supply chain still around, still sustainable and still intact. And that's what we need to see.
Philip, thank you. Wendy, can I turn to you now for your thoughts on small businesses and their use of credit?
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry there, I didn't notice if I was on mute or not. Yeah, and you know, this is quite interesting in that we've mentioned a number of times now that we are facing very challenging times. And if I think about that in a pause for a moment, I think any business in business knows about challenges. They are challenge facers, right? However, the danger that most businesses are facing right now is to enter a reactive mode, where I may be thinking, you know, what I'm doing worked. I don't change my systems. I continue running on the same processes. I continue doing everything as I did before because it's worked. But the true challenge we are all facing is that both customers, you, I, you know, businesses, the workforce is changing. So as a result of the pandemic, we actually need to start understanding really well where that evolution is driving us. So it is imperative for businesses that they spend time looking at things like productivity. I agree with you that cash flow is the puzzle as ever for any business. But one of the things that gets often overlooked is what I'm doing today taking my business to the places that I want it to be? Are the tools that I'm using today effective enough for what I want to achieve? Actually, are the tools that were working for me before no longer serving me the purpose in this new reality we're all facing? And even beyond that, right? Because we need to think about this. Are the providers and people that I'm relying on for certain services thinking about the future? And what are the things that they are planning so that I don't have to worry about them? And to give you an example of what's, you know, in my mind about this is, and I know these are very scary terms. Don't worry, I'll expand a little bit more about this in our upcoming sections. But I think when we talk about machine learning and we talk about artificial intelligence, businesses tend to be very intimidated by those terms because everybody talks about them, but no one really understands what they are about. So in this new world, what we want to ensure is that any tool that touches technology, inform yourself if they are planning towards the future. How is this piece of technology that you're paying £1 a month, £2 a month, whatever it is you're paying for, are they thinking about automation? Are they thinking about innovation so that I don't have to worry about those things? And there's a lot of value in automating, right? That can drive a lot of productivity forward for simple tasks like daily things that you're repetitively doing, monthly reports that you may unnecessarily be running, things that you may just be passing over information from one side to the other. And what I find most often, right, is you were right, Philip and Andrea, you were mentioning a little bit about fear. Businesses, of course, fear what they don't understand. When it comes to loans, if I don't understand what's in the loan, of course, I'm not going to take it up. And the same applies to technology, right? It's like one of the searches that we get most often within our Sage products is, how can I undo? Which tells you a lot, the mindset when somebody's trying something new, they go, oh, I don't know what I did. delete, undo. So it is removing that fear that trying something new is okay and that new things can be accomplished. You can just choose the small steps. Start today by saying, how can I get all my money movements in one single screen? So that's my 2 cents on that.
Great, thank you, Wendy. And I think we will come back to some of the themes you've identified there. So we've already touched on a number of these, and I'm just going to encourage my speaker colleagues there to keep moving as we move through this next section. It's an important one, and it's the role for open banking. How do you see open banking and the role it can play in helping small businesses as they recover from this pandemic crisis? Wendy, I'll come back to you first.
I think, as I was saying, it is all about starting with baby steps, right? For example, and this is a typical one we get asked very often, is removing paper something that we should be aiming to do? Well, removing paper is certainly a baby step, right? There's a lot of ways of starting to move a business towards a more productivity process. And one thing that is important for businesses to focus on is to not be passive about their processes. To give you an example, at Sage, we have something that we call a productivity monitoring tool. It's available online, and I can share the link with all of you. And in that tool, we've estimated that in the UK, £3 billion a month is lost in unnecessary administrative work and just processes. So to give you an idea of the size, this is about £1,200,000 per second. So every second of this call, just calculate how much money has been overspent in unproductive steps. So there are tools, if we were to take paper, for example, that leverage OCR technology, read the paper, digitize that piece of work, put it into a system that can automatically input this invoice into your accounting system and then post it into the right books. You don't have to think about it anymore. And going back to the example that I was giving before, another baby step that is very valuable, it's simply understanding where the money is going at what time, all in one single view. We know at Sage that any small and medium business size business has in between 3 to 5 different financial institutions registered, because they may have current accounts, savings accounts for different purposes on how they manage their books. So having this data segregated into different pockets of information takes a lot of time from anybody's desk. So start, just by aggregating that data. A lot of applications out there in the Open Banking Initiative will enable this very, very simple initial step. Now, if we were to look at this into the steps to execution, you can have a look at which ones are the applications or the connections I can make today to have one single view of my data. How can I add meaning to that data? Because the question isn't, can I collect the data? The question is, what does this data mean to my business? And finally, use the tools that will actually give you insights of that data. So for example, are the tools that I'm using today available to alert me when there's an anomaly in my payments? Have I received less money than I expected? Is one of my suppliers unable to pay me for the foreseen future? Who is that? What does that do to my forecasts? And really, here as a group, we are all to kind of give our view on how can we prepare businesses for uncertain times. And I think the best nugget that we've learned from speaking to so many businesses is that the best thing to have is to plan for several scenarios. Always plan for the worst and the best case scenario. Tools like Sage Accounting, to mention one, again, go visit the Open Banking Applications store. There are a ton of applications that can actually help you create that forecasting process. What happens if I fail to have this amount of cash flow in my system? So apart from leveraging the plethora of applications that you're going to find out there, I would also encourage everybody in the audience to have a bit of reflection around what real-time data access means to everyone. So when you think about it, right, any business processing their reporting and understanding the health of their business generally creates reports that are a month old or a quarter old. And then once that they have all of that data, they look at this data and they go, oh, okay, this, on the basis of this historical data, now I'm going to project how I'm going to do in the future. That's a very backwards process. Open banking today and all the applications around the ecosystem now give us the tool to actually have access to real-time data. So today you could be performing reconciliation, have a look at your balance sheet, and be able to accurately have a forecast that gets you closer to how the business health is going to look in the next week, 2 weeks, month. And I think one of the things that I've made us, you know, again, to mention for sure in this session, it's about businesses used to relate the concept of innovation with expensive. Most businesses that tend to say, look, innovation right now is not a good fit for my business, is because they relate it to expensive. But when you look at the open banking model, that is precisely one of the burdens, one of the boundaries that we're removing, right? That everything becomes so much more accessible for everyone. So that gives you really all of the tools to have a much more proactive and future-looking view of any business.
Wendy, thank you. That's really helpful. And I think that sort of making decisions in the moment is a really important component. Philip, if I can come on to you and then Andrea, mindful of our timing, and I'm keen to give our audience the opportunities to raise questions with us. I suspect some questions are coming through on the chat already. So if I can just turn to you, role for open banking, Philip, and then Andrea.
Thanks, Mark. Well, I think we've heard a lot from Wendy and from Andrea, and I don't want to expand on that too much. I think it's really important that we use open banking as a means to an end, as I said earlier. I think there are a number of solutions out there which are fed by open banking that make life better for small businesses. Anything that enables them to speed up the flow of cash into their business seamlessly, efficiently and quickly has to be good, and open banking is a means to that end. I think Andrea made a really good point earlier about the knowledge that businesses need, and Wendy was just talking about the importance of data and so on. And the more data businesses have that can be processed quickly and easily, the better decisions and more informed decisions they can make. And I think one of the things that this community has to do is to make sure that small businesses are educated in what is available to them, how it can be easily implemented, and what a difference it can make to their businesses.
Philip, thank you. Andrea.
Yes, I think just picking up on two things. Philip mentioned cash is king, and Wendy mentioned how SMEs passively embrace, they passively have embraced poor service, poor product fit, and severe overcharging in the services that they consume as businesses. And why has that been the case? Mainly due to complexity and opacity. And what open banking does is actually remove both of those obstacles, gives transparency, and that allows us to show back to customers how much their services are really costing them, what really is the best product for them. And there's no better way for me to talk about the power of open banking other than to give you a case study from our platform where a business micro enterprise turning over 100,000 was rejected for a loan from his bank, wanted 25,000. He integrated his bank accounts, and we analyzed that he could save close to £8,000 because he was making international payments from his bank account. We compared it via an API integration in real time to show me would have saved more with an independent provider. We were then able to see his banking was costing him £900, and we were able to switch him to a new bank. And so all of those costs led to essentially his first year of repayments for his £25,000 loan, and we were able to match him to that lender because an alternative provider had a product that exactly matched his business. So he got his loan, he got the first year repayments made, he's reduced those costs for a permanent time. So in terms of where businesses need to focus now in their recovery, it's improve your cost structure. That's what open banking can help with. Make sure you're getting access to the right funding at the right time. That's what open banking can help with. And so this is why I'm saying the adoption rates, as businesses may not know it's the functionality of open banking that's delivering those solutions and rewards to them. But truly, that's what we're able to do thanks to having this standard in place in the UK.
Andrea, thank you very much. Mindful of time, I'm going to pause the sessions, and in particular, I'm going to pause the talking heads, and I'm going to call on my colleague Daniel Jenkinson, who I hope is anticipating this slight change. Daniel, are there some questions that are coming through that from our audience that we can ask our panel to respond to?
Ian Cass has highlighted a challenge, and I think this lends itself to a great question. So, in a sense, we've had, great case studies of the value that open banking can bring, but Ian points out that a survey that said that that 72% of respondents have heard of open banking, but only 8% were aware that it could have a positive impact on their business. And so there clearly is a big gap between the awareness of the benefits and what benefits really are. And I guess that's a question. So if these things are so helpful and are so important, what do we need to do, I guess, for the panel, to think about what do we need to do to get small businesses to adopt and use these new services? And that's, I think, a great question to ask.
It is, and Andrea picked up on this actually earlier on, when she said that it's not open banking itself, but it's the positive benefits that, broadly speaking, open banking driven products and services can bring. And so that's something which we're really keen, sort of, as open banking. We don't want to allow the kind of issue that Ian has identified to stop small businesses moving forward and identifying things. Andrea, is it reasonable? Could I perhaps ask you just to pick that up again?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's really important that none of us within the industry get hung up on these surveys that say, "Are you aware of open banking?" That's, if you were to say to someone, "Are you aware of whatever the technology is behind contactless?" They're not aware of the infrastructure. What they're aware of, and when they experience the direct result of it, is where the delight comes from. And how can we improve the adoption of open banking? This is purely a question of distribution. We can all build the greatest product in the world. If we do not have distribution, then these things fail. So what we're doing is not just going direct to market. I think TPPs have a journey to go down in terms of market awareness when we're up against big brands. So we're saying, that's fine. We will white label our technology. So for example, we launched with the British Chamber of Commerce this month. And so 53 chambers where businesses would never have heard of open banking, probably would never have integrated their cloud accounting, etc., are now thinking, oh, my membership, my chamber now has this tool that's going to help me manage my finances and access the funding I need to get me through this recovery. So their connection is with the chamber. What the chamber has is a tool powered by open banking, delivered by Swoop. So it's all about distribution and making sure that the benefits are big enough. And we're seeing more adoption in terms of banks are now the biggest users of open banking. And so the more businesses see these behaviors emerging within their apps or whatever it is, that's where it's going to come from. So I think let's not worry as an industry or an organization about this question. I think, look, if the product's good enough and the solution is good enough, you will have adoption. So that's my take on it.
Great, thank you very much.
There's another very interesting question. I don't want to put Philip on the spot too much, and I know Philip is not technically part of the government, but the question here is quite a spiky question. When are government and the CMA planning to back and promote open banking? So that's from Saeed. It's a good question and quite a tough question. And I wonder, Philip, if you had any thoughts there, given the kind of very positive use cases. Is there more that can be done to promote the use of open banking and the kind of use cases we've discussed today?
Well, I think absolutely there is, and I think you're right. I don't speak for government, but
No.
I think I think it's important that the government is taking the right steps to drive it. And we all know we have to eat more healthily, but we only do it because we see the benefits of doing so. Unfortunately, you can only see my head and shoulders, so you have no need to see the evidence of whether or not I do. But similarly, I think Andrew made the point really well, that actually it's the benefits that count. And so government needs to be sharing far more around the case studies demonstrating the power. When my caseworkers talk to small businesses that aren't getting paid, one of our first questions is, what technology do you use? How do you use it? What do you do to try and prevent the problem of late payment in the first place? And I think we need businesses to understand that actually many things are within their own control if they adopt technology that is there and is useful and can be used for them. And I think it's incumbent on government and the whole of the payments industry, including OBIE, to make sure that we use every opportunity and every method to get businesses to see and recognise the real benefits that are practical, that come out in what they do rather than what we say.
And there's another interesting question that I've spotted in the chat, Daniel, from Harry Warren, where he says, will innovative lending options ever truly take off whilst the government and Bank of England continue to prioritise big incumbent banks to distribute financial support? And I think that's a really interesting one. And obviously, open banking is a competition and markets, or it's part of a remedy to improve competition following adverse effects on competition identified in their 2016 market investigation. And it is ironic that this particular crisis, which obviously the CMA didn't anticipate, but it has actually driven large numbers of small businesses back to their incumbent banks. And just reminding people that, and again, my statistics are broadly correct, I think, but 5 banks, all of them members of the CMA 9, provide business current accounts to about 90% of the population of small businesses. That is a structural lack of competition at a sort of terrifying level. And whether we like it or not, there has been some unfortunate impact of the crisis in terms of being concentrative rather than actually helping new entrants come along. I'm going to come back to you again, Andrea, just briefly for a comment on that, if I may, because I think perhaps that's one that you may want to add to.
Yes, we've been banging this drum along with Innovate Finance, every group that you can possibly think of. I think I understand. Look, there was a crisis. The government needed to react. This program already existed for the traditional accredited lenders, the banks, under the Enterprise Finance Guarantee Scheme. And the version that we've seen for coronavirus was essentially a fund that was ready to go for a hard Brexit. So I think in terms of a quick decision, they made the right one. The unfortunate thing is that I think we've now gone back 10 steps in terms of competition. Now, where I see, we've all had to accept that. Every week we have a new accredited lender announced, but the problem is awareness, because when the government made the announcement in the first place, they said, and go to your primary bank. We did a survey with Festival of Enterprise where we asked people about the awareness of the products and where they felt that they could go for a CBILS loan, and 100% said the only place they could go was the bank, which is of course not true. So the government has not been helpful in terms of utilizing what is actually probably one of the UK's best assets, which is its fintech industry. It has not utilized that in the early stages of the crisis, but I'll give them a bit of a benefit of the doubt because of the situation. Now, where we can really start to wind back some of the losses we've just had is when we get into this recovery phase. So we've got banks who let's be honest, they didn't want to be at the forefront of being the economic heroes here. They were told, you are distributing these loans. And there is a minimum of 25% of those loans that they never would have taken on. So it's against their risk appetite. So when things start to calm down and we start to look at recovery and triaging those businesses, I think this is where the alternative finance market will start to step in again. And so what we're looking at is, where are those SMEs that will struggle with their banks in terms of liquidity, and then looking at reappropriating them and refinancing them to the alternative lenders who have different models. So I agree with your the question that was arose, and I think we do have an opportunity to try and redress that balance as we go on into the next 12 to 18 months.
Andrea, thank you. Daniel, anything further that we feel we should be?
There's some good questions. Anna Gallego from the CBI kind of says, is this the right time to encourage open banking adoption, given how many challenges they've got? And so I guess she's asking, is it the right kind of time to do this, which is an interesting question.
It is, and I think I would respond to that. There's no time like the present. But others may have a view as well. Wendy, do you want to just give your quick thought on that, and then I think I'm going to try and summarise. I'm keen that we finish on time, but there's an opportunity there for your thoughts on timing of really reaching out and trying to get small businesses to better understand what open banking driven propositions can do for them at this time.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Mark. There's no time like the present. Timing is everything for businesses. And if you cannot change when the times are changing, then when are you going to change? So there's definitely no better time to start, touching on the value that open banking is adding to businesses. But today, you see, it's very easy for businesses to keep the kind of sticking to their old processes. I think this is the right time to start actually leveraging open banking. If there was ever a doubt because our older systems were working just fine, I think the pandemic has heavily put into question everything. To give you just a small teeny tiny example, just to set up, say, something simple like a bank feed, the great majority of the incumbents will work with integrations that require users to fill out a paper form that literally someone fills in with a pen, then somebody scans, and that takes processing. As soon as the pandemic hit, the incumbents and us had to come up with a digital solution. What was that solution? Open banking. Because the journey is digital, right? So something simple like that.
Good. No, well, thank you. And I am now going to just try and summarize things. I think we've identified, I've really enjoyed that conversation, and I'm very grateful to our panelists for their contributions. I think we've identified a number of issues. So overcoming small business aversion to tech and innovation, harnessing its power to help, using automation and real-time information to provide better quality warnings, warning signs, better insights, helping small businesses to take control, shop around, get better value, and not just revert to the old way in which they've always done things. So I think those are a series of messages. But if I have to extract from all of that and all of the conversation we've had, the key message, then I think it is that there is a massive potential for small businesses in the things that open banking can make happen. But there is also, at some level, a lack of knowledge, at other levels, a lack of trust. There's a tendency, when everything is seeming to change, to want to hang on to the sort of old and traditional values. And actually, I can well understand people feeling, golly, so much is changing, I'm not going to do anything else that might bring further change upon myself, particularly if it all feels a bit unfamiliar and a bit complicated. So I think the first thing we need to do, and we've got a wide range of stakeholders and interested parties on this call, and I think there are things that everybody can do. Every sort of single participant, I think, can do something to help. And what is it that we're really trying to do? Well, I think the key to all of this is demonstrating that innovation of the kind represented by open banking and the products and services which it drives is a friend and not a foe of small businesses. And that's that for me is a core and key message. And in order to get that across, I think one has to demonstrate benefits. And we've had lots and lots of examples in the kinds of use cases that we've had. If you go onto the open banking website and look at the power of the network, you'll see all manner of further products, all manner of further use cases which can help small businesses. So demonstrate benefits, demystify. Everybody who's spoken today has, as far as I can see, very much spoken in words of one syllable. Wendy's talked about her baby steps. That whole demystification for small businesses and those that represent them is something that is really, really important. Mm-hmm. And in that way, I believe that the fear factor can be banished, trust can be built, and open banking can deliver the undoubted benefits which it can produce for small businesses. So I think we have come up to 1 o'clock. I was keen to try and run a tight ship. I'm going to close, if I may, then by thanking all of our participants, Andrea, Philip, Wendy. I'd like to thank also colleagues at Open Banking for the very smooth running of this call, or it certainly runs smoothly from my point of view, and I hope it has for all of our other participants. Thank you all very much indeed for joining, and I wish you all well.